What made me strong as a young Aboriginal girl, was growing up in the Aboriginal community. Back then, I was born in 1955, so 55, 60, in the 60s, the early 60s. My mother, Frances Gallagher, we all know back then how hard it was for Aboriginal people to get sound employment, get jobs, and I have very vivid memories of me living throughout Gunai-Kurnai country, which is Gippsland, and my mother had to follow the seasonal picking, because a lot of Aboriginal people also had to do the same thing, a lot of other Aboriginal families. And so as a result of that, I grew up throughout Gunai-Kurnai country in my early years, picking beans and onions and potatoes. But as a result of that, I went to 19 different primary schools. Now, as a young girl, that life was adventurous, and I thought it was amazing. I remember Archie Roach, his song he sings about the city lights of Old Fitzroy. I remember sitting in the back of an old ute, and this is well before seatbelts were compulsory. Well, we didn't have seatbelts. Sitting in the back of an old ute with my two younger siblings and driving across a big bridge in Gippsland, and looking out over that bridge, all the campfire lights of Aboriginal camps. And that's where we lived in growing up in that environment. And it was just amazing for a young girl. But as an adult, it would have been very hard surviving that way, especially if you got little kids. It impacted on me to know what it's like to live in poverty. It impacted on me to know what it's like to be part of a community. That had positive impacts, by the way. That I knew I was part of something bigger than me and my family. It wasn't just my family. I got to meet many amazing Aboriginal people who are no longer with us. But from a impact of knowing how hard it is to make ends meet, to see my mother having to work like that, and we did before school and after school, when I did go to school. No, school's important. How hard it is to make sure that we got food on the table. I remember there were many times when we had to go without. I remember when we lived up near Orbost, and a little place called Numarella Pines. And I think, who was it that sang about Numarella Pines? Wasn't Archie, it was... Anyways, it'll come to me. But there's a song that sings about Numarella Pines, and it's just before you hit Orbost. And that's where a lot of Aboriginal families lived, at Numarella Pines. Can I say the impacts? My mum grew up when racism was in your face. And it wasn't safe to be black back then, by the way. So it was I remember a time when we were living down in Warrnambool, and Mum wanted to take us. Very rarely did we get the opportunity to go and have a counter meal in the pub, right? Very rarely. But we were denied access because Mum's Aboriginal. Now, I can go undercover. If I take my earrings off and my Aboriginal shirt when I'm wearing it, I can meld into society and people wouldn't know that I'm Aboriginal unless you knew me. But whereas my mum and my other siblings could not do that. Like my son today is visibly Aboriginal, so he could not take his shirt off or his earrings off, not that he wears earrings. But it was really the impacts that racism has on an individual and a family and a community are profound. When you look at that, the trauma, you look at trauma that's compounded over many years, how that's transferred through the generations. It has, and that's why you see today, you see the statistics that we all hear about and we all talk about. We talk about the overrepresentation of our people in the justice system, our children in out-of-home care at alarming rates. We know all those, and that's the impacts of racism over generations, and that's the impacts of lack of hope too, by the way. If you grow up in a community where there's very little hope of getting a job, very little hope of creating wealth, that has profound impacts on your well-being. As I said before, as a result of going to 19 different primary schools, I never thought that I would amount to anything, by the way. When we moved to Melbourne, we lived in Fitzroy, and we experienced same issues that a lot of other Aboriginal families experience, like trying to make ends meet and paying private rent. We didn't live in public housing, and it was extremely difficult. So I eventually ran away from home when I was 13. Ran away from home. I left school at 13, by the way, because high school here in Fitzroy, because I couldn't cope with the racism. Now, I don't know whether it was racism because I was Aboriginal or because I was poor. But, you know, we used to take damper to school for our lunch. And other kids, non-Aboriginal kids, would make fun of you as a result of that. So I left school at 13, I got into trouble at 13, I lived on the streets at 13, and went to juvenile detention at 13. So I thought I was actually taking a different road, and until my mid-20s I was a single mum, and I worked at the the Victorian Aboriginal Women's Refuge here in Melbourne. And I knew that when I looked at my mother's life, when I looked at her lack of hope and her experiences in her life, I wanted to make a difference, but I knew I didn't have an education. And to make a difference in this world, in a modern world today, you have to have both. You have to have an education, and you also have to be grounded in your culture and your people and your community. That's what I believe. So I decided then I was going to go back to school. I got a traineeship job under Joan Kirner. I went back to school. I went to La Trobe University studying archaeology. That's where I wanted to go. I wanted to learn about my culture, my past, because colonisation had such a big impact on that knowledge not being passed down. We all know about the missions. My mum lived on a mission, I never did. And I thank my lucky stars that I never did. So the stories I hear about them, they weren't very nice at all. There's a publication you can have a look at called Aboriginal Letters from Victorian Aboriginal Women read that publication, then you can have a bit of an insight in what it was like to live on a mission. So I went back, I got a job, a traineeship in the Museum of Victoria, I got into culture, but I wanted to do something different. I understand that it's important to protect culture, but I also wanted to make a difference in how Aboriginal people are perceived in this world. It was pretty ambitious for a young black woman. But as I grew, I learned more and more, because we didn't learn about it in school, when I did go to school. We didn't learn about the atrocities that were committed in this country in the name of colonisation. We didn't learn about that. And as I grew older and older, I made it a point that I wanted to learn more about what happened to our people and why. I needed to understand why. And as you grow older, you learn about, the concept of terra nullius, what that meant when it wasn't true. You learn about the missions and the aim of the missions, and you learn about what it was like prior to colonisation in this country and how long our people have lived on this continent. So I wanted to understand why, and then I didn't travel overseas until very late in life. And so when I went overseas for the first time in my life, it was to New Zealand. And when I went over there, I saw the Māori culture in the landscape. It was visible. But we weren't visible in our own country, here in Australia. Most people on the planet know about what happened in other cultures across the planet, across the world, right? We know about what happened to the Jewish people during the wars. We learn about what happened in South Africa with apartheid. The same thing happened here, but no one knows about that. We were hidden from the world. And we weren't visible in our own country. As years progressed, our culture wasn't visible. And so, to me, that's not right. We need to be visible in our own country. So seeing what happened in New Zealand and seeing what happened in Canada, at least their cultures were visible in the fabric of their country. We are not. How long has it been just to get our flags being displayed? And that's slowly happening, and it's amazing. But the flag it's more than that. It's seeing us in the fabric of this country. That's what's important about that. And being visible and not hidden to the world. Why it's important to me to not blame today's non-Aboriginal generations for what happened in the past. It's important to me because I learnt this from my mother. If anyone, my mother's generations of peoples, our peoples, could hold, what's the word? Whether it's hatred or whether it's, you need to be guilty, that sort of attitude. But my mother never did. She taught me forgiveness, and she taught me integrity. And I learnt from her that by blaming people for what happened in the past is not the right thing. I thought it was important to tell Australia, you are not responsible for your ancestors' deeds, but you are responsible to make change for today and stop being bystanders. very much so. And I actually, what inspired me, apart from my mum, was Nelson Mandela, believe it or not. When he got out of prison, he's a man who could have held so much hatred and hurts for what happened to his people. But he didn't, because he knew that the only way to make change in South Africa was to unite South Africa, black and white. He knew that. I think my leadership is a style that tries to bring other people along with me, empower other voices, not just mine. I believe that's me. I believe I have an open style of leadership, and I learnt from many good people about leadership style. I mentioned one of them, but you know, there's a lot of elders here in our own communities in Victoria, people like Aunty Marge Tucker, William Cooper, Aunty Alma Thorpe, Jack Charles, what an amazing leader. Even though he never thought he would probably set out to be a leader, but he was. In the end, he was an amazing leader. And there's others that I just, you know, Uncle Jim Berg, I mean, what an amazing leader. People who have paved the way in many ways for not only my generations, but future generations. So my leadership style is not about, it's about empowering other people to make decisions and to, you know, I wouldn't ask anyone to do anything that I'm not prepared to do myself. I think anger helps, by the way. I am. Sometimes I'm very angry, and sometimes I'm very scared. But anger, if channeled in the right way, can be quite useful. But I'm not angry. I'm not angry at today's generation. It's like if I went and committed a very violent, serious crime. My family and my community aren't responsible for that. So I wouldn't be angry at them, or no one should be angry at them. But it's the same here. I mean, today's generations of non-Aboriginal people or Australian citizens are not responsible for what happened in the past. But they should try and help us to make the change that we need to have for future generations, for the original people of this continent. That was a challenge when I was the Treaty Commissioner. That was one of the biggest challenges that I had when my role was to set up a voice here in Victoria, basically a mechanism so that the state government can talk to. And the realisation that we are in the year, you know, in a modern world, colonisation happened and we can't unhappen that. We can't change that. It happened. And we have a colonial structure, whether we like it or not, as First Peoples, we have it, it's there. We can't dismantle it. We can't send every white fella home. That's just not practical. So in a modern world, and in traditional lifestyle, we never had a statewide peak body. We had clan-based. And there was nations, like the Gunditjmara Nation, which had multiple clans in it, but still clans were their own entities and made their own decisions, but not as a collective. So we had to work out, how do we set up a voice that's going to work in the year 2020 or whenever it was, 2021, in the year 2023 and beyond. We need to set up a structure that is going to work. So that was the dilemma, and I know there was a lot of other voices who weren't happy with how we structured the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and they wanted to go back to a traditional way of doing it. But I didn't know that way, and I didn't know anyone who could tell me that way, by the way, even though there's some people who thought they could. But colonisation did its job. It impacted on our ways of knowing and our ways of being and doing. So we had to do a hybrid model. And what I heard around the state of Victoria from Aboriginal people, we don't want government appointed or government elected representatives. So we want to be able to elect our own representatives, Jill. Well, you had to, otherwise you won't be successful. You had to try and walk and work in two worlds. You had to. And believe it or not, but Mandela taught me that. He knew that when he got out of prison and became president, he knew he had to unite and walk in two worlds. He knew that. Otherwise he wouldn't be successful. And look at us today here in Victoria. We have an amazing First Peoples Assembly who've done some amazing work in such a short amount of time, and we're almost there to negotiate treaties. How amazing is that? Oh, geez. I mean, I'm no scholar, but all I know is what kept me going through the treaty process as the Treaty Commissioner, because there were some times there where it was really hard going and I felt so alone because I was only one person, and I felt like, oh, it's all too hard, I'm going to give up. As long as you know what you're doing is the best you can do in this life to advance people and our people, as long as you believe that's the right thing and you don't give up, then you will kick goals. There will be big achievements. That was the hardest part. That was one of my biggest challenges, and every time I think of it, I get emotional. So, anyways, when the state government decided to listen to the Aboriginal voices here in Victoria and put treaty proper on the table, that was amazing, because how long have we been calling for treaties? And I was so excited. I thought, oh God, yes. And I knew I wanted to be involved. I knew. I never dreamt that I'd be the Treaty Commissioner, but I just wanted to be involved. And so I did. I got involved, and I ended up being the Treaty Commissioner. And I thought it was going to be a breeze, because we all wanted treaty. I thought it was going to be so easy. I never thought that I would be called a murderer. I never thought I would be called a Johnny-come-lately. I never thought I would have been disrespected like that. But I was, and I remember there was some Aboriginal people who sent me messages to say, Jill, don't listen. You're doing an amazing job. Keep going. That was the fuel that I needed to keep going. Not just listening to the negativity.